The ring shouldn't have been in the trash, not that ring, not the one she had thrown back at him in disgust outside the court steps the day she ended it all with a glare sharp enough to draw blood and words that still echoed in her ears. You're nothing but a street sweeper, I can't spend my life in dirt and shame. And she'd walked away, not bothering to look back, not caring if he cried or begged or broke down. She had her future to think about, her reputation, her family, her pride. But now, 2 years later, she stood frozen behind the bakery where she worked part-time and stared into the trash bin where something shiny caught her eye, and there it was, nestled in grease-stained wrappers and a broken bottle, the exact ring he had bought for her, a modest silver band with a single stone, scratched and scuffed but still whole, still painful, still his. She couldn't breathe. Her hand moved without thinking, dipping into the filth to retrieve it, heart pounding in her chest like a drum of guilt. Her fingers closed around it, and that was when her phone buzzed once, then again, then a third time, so hard it nearly slipped from her hand. She unlocked the screen, eyes narrowing. It was a video, no sender, no name, just a file. She pressed play and her world tilted. The footage showed a black car pulling up to a velvet rope, cameras flashing, a sleek hand opening the back door, and then he stepped out. Sahil, not hunched, not tired, not in the faded orange vest of the municipal workers, but in a tailored tuxedo with his hair slicked back, his smile calm and cold and confident, as if he had never been on his knees begging her not to leave, as if he had never swept a gutter in his life. The camera panned as people clapped and someone shouted his name. She could barely hear it over the ringing in her ears, and then the video ended abruptly, followed by a message written in plain white text against a black screen. Sometimes the man you throw away becomes the man everyone else wants. Are you ready for part 2? She blinked rapidly, feeling heat rise in her chest, a mixture of shame, confusion, and something else, something like fear. She hadn't seen him since that day. She hadn't heard from him, not once. He had disappeared completely, no calls, no messages, nothing, like he had been erased from the earth. And honestly, she'd liked it that way. She told herself she'd done the right thing. She was still young, still beautiful. She deserved someone successful, someone her mother would approve of, not a man who spent his days sweeping streets and nights sleeping in a shared flat with no future, no ambition. But now here he was, stepping out of luxury cars, being photographed. What had happened? Who had filmed this? Why had it been sent to her? And why now? As she stood there frozen, holding the ring like it was a ticking bomb, her phone buzzed again. One new message, this time a short one. He's back, and not just for headlines. Her stomach flipped. She looked around the alley, suddenly unsure if she was alone. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back toward the back door of the cafe, but everything felt different, colder, heavier, like the past was crawling up her spine and whispering in her ear. This wasn't a coincidence, this was a message. Someone knew what she had done, someone wanted her to feel it. And Sahil, he had disappeared, yes, but not into nothing. He had vanished into something powerful, something calculated, and now it felt like he was coming back. For a reason, her heart thudded in her chest as memories came flooding in, their nights on the rooftop drinking tea under the stars when they used to dream together, his hands rough from work but gentle when he touched her, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world, and then her voice snapping at him, the shame she felt when her friends found out what he did for a living, the day her father refused to bless their marriage, saying a man who cleans filth has no place in this family. And she had agreed, she had told herself love wasn't enough, not when the world would judge her for it. And now the man she threw away was famous or rich or both, and he wasn't hiding, he was showing himself deliberately. It wasn't revenge, not yet, but it felt like a warning, like the beginning of something bigger. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she did. Another message, same number, no name. You look surprised, Aruj. Don't worry, I'll help you remember what you did. Panic rose in her throat. She turned and ran into the cafe, ignoring the stares of her co-workers as she burst into the restroom, locking the door behind her and gasping for air. Her reflection stared back at her, pale eyes wide, makeup smudged, ring still clutched in her fingers. She dropped it in the sink like it burned her and tried to breathe. She splashed cold water on her face and whispered to herself over and over, it's fine, it's not real, it's not real. But deep down she knew it was real, and Sahil hadn't just moved on, he had become someone else, and he hadn't forgotten. And now he was coming back, and this time she didn't know what he wanted, but something told her it wouldn't be forgiveness. 2 years before the video, 2 years before the velvet rope and flashing cameras, Sahil sat on a broken bench outside the government hospital, rain soaking through his threadbare uniform, his hands shaking from both cold and the sting of Aruj's words still ringing in his ears. The humiliation, the look in her eyes as if he were a disease she couldn't wash off, had carved something deep into him, and no matter how hard he tried he couldn't make it stop echoing. He had thought she loved him, he truly believed that love could be enough, that their dreams and plans and long late-night talks could outweigh her family's judgment and her social circle's whispers. But when she handed back the ring, not even wrapped, not even gently, just thrown back like a cheap souvenir, it broke something in him, and he realized that no matter how clean he kept the streets, he'd never be clean enough for her. And that night something inside him snapped, not in anger but in silence, in a quiet storm that brewed in his chest and wouldn't let go. He didn't go home that night. He walked for hours through the pouring rain, through empty roads and alleys, asking himself what he had left, who he was now, without her, without a future. And by morning, when the sun rose dull and gray, he stood in front of the city's largest landfill and looked out at the endless piles of what people discarded, what they no longer valued, what was thrown away, not because it was useless but because it didn't look good anymore. And in that moment he decided he would become something unthrowable, something the world couldn't ignore, not to win her back. No, he had let go of that illusion, but to prove that a man isn't defined by what he does but by what he becomes. And from that moment he began disappearing, not in body but in identity. He quit his job without notice, changed his number, disappeared from social media, moved into a dingy hostel far from the city, and started reading, learning anything, everything he could about business, about branding, about psychology. Every hour of the day he cleaned buildings by night and consumed books by morning. While others slept, he watched lectures, saved every rupee, worked with small vendors just to understand how things moved, how people thought, how the world measured value. And slowly, over months, he found patterns. He began investing small amounts in broken businesses, convincing shopkeepers to let him help them in exchange for a portion of the profits. And when the first one doubled in revenue, he knew he was onto something. Soon he had 5, then 10, then 20 shops, all small, all in the background, but all growing, all believing in the quiet man who never asked for credit but always delivered. And within a year Sahil was managing a silent empire across the city. But he wasn't done. He changed his name officially to Arman Shah, a name with no past and no baggage. He hired a team, used his savings to build a consulting agency, and began working with high-end clients who never asked where he came from, only what he could do. And what he did was transform struggling businesses into gold mines. By the time he was invited to the award ceremony in that video, he had appeared on magazine covers under his new identity. He had spoken at conferences, launched a fund that gave jobs to the very workers the world ignored, and all the while he kept a file in a locked drawer marked Aruj. Inside were photos, articles, even a copy of their old engagement photo, and a note he had written to himself the night she left that simply said, "Don't become bitter, become unforgettable." And now, 2 years later, when her number popped up in the call log of one of his bakery investments under a different name, he knew it was her. She didn't recognize the brand, didn't know he was behind it, but when he saw her on the CCTV footage standing outside the store holding the ring he had secretly placed in the trash that morning, he knew she had found the bait. He smiled, because this wasn't revenge, this was exposure, the truth being revealed layer by layer, not through violence, not through public shaming, but through presence and power. And now the next part of his plan was unfolding perfectly. He had her attention, but he wanted more. He wanted understanding. He wanted her to feel not pain but recognition, to see herself not as a villain but as a mirror to every person who judged someone by the surface. And so he sent her the first message, the video, then the second, and then the third. And now he waited, seated in the private lounge of his office high above the city, in a building she probably walked past every day, never knowing who owned it. And as he looked out at the skyline, his assistant stepped in and said, "She's here." He nodded, told her to bring her in, and when the door opened and Aruj walked in, hesitant, unsure, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the room, he stood slowly and met her gaze. And in that moment everything paused, all the years, all the wounds, all the distance. And when she opened her mouth to speak, he raised one hand gently and said, "No explanations, not yet. First I want you to sit and listen, and then decide if you still think I'm just a street sweeper." And with that he walked to the window and let her take in the empire he had built, the world he had carved from rejection and silence and buried pain. And behind her he saw her reflection in the glass, the same woman who had broken him, now slowly beginning to realize that she hadn't just lost a man, she had lost something much bigger than she ever imagined. Aruj sat down slowly, her legs stiff with tension, as if every movement might shatter the air around her, which already felt so tight and heavy it was hard to breathe. And across from her, Sahil, or the man who now called himself Arman, stood tall, calm, too calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment so many times that now it was just business. And yet behind his silence there was something burning, something restrained and dangerous, not like violence but like memory, a powerful kind that doesn't yell but waits, and when he turned back from the window his eyes met hers, and in that second she saw it, the man she once knew still lived there somewhere deep down under the expensive suit and sharp jawline, and the way he carried himself like the world now owed him nothing but respect. And she swallowed hard, unsure of what to say first, unsure if she had any right to say anything at all, and so she just said one thing: "I didn't know," and it came out too soft, too broken. "Anne." He nodded once slowly. "I know you didn't. But you never asked either," and that silence struck her harder than any insult ever could, because he was right. She hadn't asked, she had assumed, she had let her pride speak louder than her heart, and now here they were years later, strangers wearing old memories like clothes that didn't fit. And he walked slowly toward his desk, picked up a small folder and handed it to her. She opened it carefully, not knowing what to expect, and inside were photos, documents, news clippings, screenshots of his journey, each one more impossible than the last, from street corners to stage lights, from broken slippers to designer shoes, from invisible to unforgettable. And her eyes filled with a strange kind of ache, not jealousy, not even regret, yet just ache, the ache of knowing she had watched a man's beginning and walked away before the real story even started. And she looked up, her voice cracking. "How did you do all this?" And he said with no anger, "Just fact, you helped more than you know." And she didn't speak because there was nothing she could say, nothing that wouldn't sound cheap or too late. And then he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping low but clear. "Do you remember that night on the roof when you said if we had nothing else we'd still have each other?" And she nodded slowly, yes, and he continued, "That was the last time I believed you, and that too was a knife, a truth so sharp she felt it run through her, and for a second she wanted to cry, but she didn't, not yet, because crying now would feel selfish." And he didn't stop, he kept going. "I don't hate you, Aruj, I never did, not even when you walked away, not even when your family told mine I was garbage, not even when I lost everything because of how much I had built around you. I didn't hate you because you were only doing what the world taught you to do, judge, measure, reject." And she closed her eyes because hearing it aloud made it too real, and when she opened them again she saw him looking not at her but through her, into the past maybe, or the memory of who she was. And then he said, "I brought you here today not for revenge, not to humiliate you, I don't need to hurt you to prove I'm worth something. I brought you here because I want you to understand what you threw away, not just me but what I could have been for you, with you. If only you had believed in me the way I believed in us." And this time she did cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, her eyes leaking tears she didn't wipe away because they belonged to the truth. And she looked at him, really looked, not at the man in the suit or the successful entrepreneur, but the boy she once held hands with in the rain, the boy who wrote her poems on the back of bus tickets, the boy who once dreamed of a house with blue curtains and a lemon tree in it. It crushed her to know she was no longer part of his dream, not even as a memory. And she said, "I was scared of how people would see me, scared of living in shame, scared of losing myself in a life I didn't understand, and I took that fear and I blamed you, and I walked away because I thought it would make the fear go away, but it didn't, it never did. And now I look at you and I see everything I told myself was impossible, and I don't know how to live with that." And he listened every word and then nodded again, slow, firm. "Then I guess now you finally see what I saw all along." And then the silence settled again, but this time it didn't feel heavy, it felt clean, like something had been cut free. And then she asked the question she had feared the most, "Is there any part of you that ever wanted me back?" And he looked at her long and quiet and finally said, "I wanted the woman I thought you were, the woman who would walk beside me through dirt and through diamonds, but that woman didn't exist, and that's when I stopped wanting and started building." And she nodded, not offended, not angry, because she understood better than she ever had. And then he stood and walked to the door and opened it and said, "I don't hate you, Aruj, I never will, but I also won't invite you into a life you walked away from." And she stood slowly, heart thudding, because this time it wasn't rejection born from shame but consequence born from truth. And as she stepped into the hallway she turned back one last time, hoping maybe he would call her back, maybe offer coffee or a second chance, but he didn't. He just stood there watching with calm eyes and no malice, and somehow that made it hurt more. And when the door clicked shut behind her, she stood in the hallway alone, the ring still in her bag, in a past she couldn't undo now fully in front of her. Aruj walked out of the building with the weight of silence pressing down on her shoulders, and the streets outside felt unfamiliar even though she had walked them 1,000 times before, and each step echoed with memories she no longer owned, moments now buried in a life that no longer wanted her. And she didn't know where to go, not really, because it wasn't just the building she had left, it was an entire version of reality she had created inside her head, a fantasy where she had made the right decision where leaving Sahil had been necessary, not selfish, where he would stay small and she would rise, and yet now all that fiction had collapsed like a house built on fog, and she found herself standing outside a cafe just around the corner, one she had never noticed before, and something about it called her. Maybe it was the warmth of the lights inside, or maybe it was the need to sit down before her legs gave out, and so she stepped and quietly sat near the window and tried to breathe, and as the waiter placed a cup of chai in front of her, she realized her hands were trembling, not from cold but from the unraveling of everything she thought she understood, and just as she reached for the cup a voice broke through her thoughts, soft, calm but firm. "I wondered when you'd show up," and she looked up startled and saw a woman not much older than her, maybe late 30s, wearing a black scarf and a knowing smile, and the woman sat down without waiting for permission, as if she had every right to be there, and before Aruj could speak the woman leaned forward and said, "He didn't tell you everything, did he?" And that one sentence froze her because it felt like a crack in the world she had just started to understand, and she whispered, "Who are you?" And the woman replied, "I'm someone who's known Sahil longer than you have, someone who's seen him at his lowest and his highest, and someone who's about to tell you something that will change what you think again." And Aruj just stared, waiting, unable to form a question fast enough, and the woman continued, "When Sahil disappeared, he didn't just vanish to become rich, he vanished to protect someone, and that someone was me and my son, a boy born from a man who used to beat me, a man Sahil stood up to and nearly died for, and that night he took me and my son to a shelter, gave us everything he had, and disappeared so no one would find us, and so that the man who hurt us wouldn't come back to finish what he started, and for months he lived in silence, worked like a ghost, gave me every rupee he earned while sleeping on the floor, and never once asked for anything in return." And Aruj's heart began pounding, because this story wasn't in the folder, this wasn't part of the empire, this was something else entirely. And the woman kept going, "When I finally found my strength and left the country, he asked me for one thing, not to tell anyone, not even the people who might care, because he didn't want praise, he wanted peace. And when I heard you had come back into his life, I waited to see what he would do, and I watched you walk into his office, thinking you had the right to ask him for anything, and I saw him let you go with grace and not once throw your shame in your face, and still you have no idea what kind of man he is." And Aruj didn't realize she was crying again until her cheeks were wet, because now the guilt wasn't just about leaving him, it was about never knowing him at all. And she whispered, "Why are you telling me this?" And the woman said, "Because he won't, and because I think you need to know that what you lost wasn't a lover or a husband, it was a protector, a fighter, a man who gives without asking and builds without applause, and people like that don't come twice." And Aruj stared down at the ring in her hand, the one she had once thrown away and now held like an anchor, and she said, "I want to say sorry." And the woman nodded but said, "Don't say it to me, and maybe don't say it to him either, say it to yourself and learn." And then the woman stood, dropped some cash on the table, and walked out, disappearing into the street as quickly as she had come. And Aruj sat there in silence, feeling the storm inside her begin to change, not end but change, as if everything she thought she had lost wasn't just Sahil but a version of herself that could have been more. And she stood, walked out, and kept walking until the city thinned, and she reached a park where old people fed birds and kids chased each other, and she sat on a bench and closed her eyes and remembered the times Sahil told her that greatness wasn't about money or titles but about what you leave behind in the hearts you touch. And she didn't understand then, but she did now, and she opened her phone, found an old photo of him from years ago, and whispered into the wind, "I see you now, and I'm sorry." And maybe that wasn't enough, and maybe it never would be, but it was the first honest sentence she had said all day. And when she looked up, the sky was beginning to turn the color of dusk, soft and forgiving, like something new had just begun to grow. Sahil sat alone in his private study, a room no one entered without permission, a space filled with the sound of a ticking clock and the low hum of the ceiling fan, and he stared at the wooden box in his hand, one he hadn't opened in years, because inside it were pieces of a life he no longer lived, photos, scribbled notes, his mother's last bracelet, and a letter from a name he had sworn never to speak again, and yet here it was in his hand, old paper with edges fraying but the ink still clear. And as his fingers trembled slightly, he unfolded it and began to read, and with each line his heart beat faster, because it wasn't just a letter, it was a confession, one that came from a man now long gone, a man he had believed to be dead for over 7 years. And the words said, "Sahil, if you're reading this, I may already be gone, but you need to know the truth about your father, the truth about the life you were born into." And Sahil felt his hands go cold, because he had grown up believing his Father died in an accident when he was 6 and his mother had kept the rest hidden, but the letter continued. I didn't die that day. I ran because I was being hunted, not by the police, not by criminals, but by my own brother. And Sahil's breath caught because his uncle had raised him after his mother passed, and the man had always been strict, cold but never cruel, or so he thought. And the letter explained how his uncle had framed his father for fraud, destroyed his reputation and stolen everything, leaving Sahil's family in ruins. And Sahil sat frozen because suddenly everything made sense: the whispers, the hidden documents, the strange visits from people his mother never let him meet. And then the final line of the letter said, "Find the man named Rafiq, he knows the rest, he owes me that much." And Sahil folded the paper back up, placed it gently into the box, and sat back, his head spinning, because just when he thought the past had been buried, it reached up like roots from under the floor and wrapped around his ankles, pulling him back. And just then his phone buzzed, and it was an unknown number, and he hesitated before answering, and the voice that spoke said, "Meet me at the mosque by the old cinema. You don't know me, but your father saved my life, and I think it's time I returned the favor." And before Sahil could speak, the line went dead, and now he was standing in a whirlwind of questions, of names he hadn't heard since childhood, of truths too dangerous to ignore. And so he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out without telling anyone, not even Zara, his assistant, who had become his closest friend over the years and who was now watching him walk past her desk with a strange look in his eyes. And Sahil reached the mosque just as the sun dipped below the buildings, and he waited until a man with a limp and dark glasses approached, and without introducing himself handed him a small envelope and said, "Your father was a brave man. He died protecting someone he shouldn't have." And Sahil opened the envelope and found a photo, a blurry image of his father with a young boy, one Sahil didn't recognize, and on the back were the words, "His son is still alive, he's not safe." And Sahil looked up, but the man was already gone, swallowed by the crowd, and once again Sahil was left with nothing but a thread to pull. And he returned home that night with too much in his head to sleep, and for the first time in years he walked to the back of his property where an old lemon tree still stood, and he sat under it just like he used to when the world felt too big. And that's where Aruj found him, because she hadn't stopped thinking about their last conversation, and something inside her kept pushing her to return, not to ask for anything but to give. And when she saw him sitting there alone, head bowed back, tense, she didn't say anything. She just sat beside him, and he looked at her but said nothing. And after a long moment he handed her the letter, and she read it slowly, and when she looked up, her eyes were wide and full of a sadness that wasn't about them but about what he had carried all this time. And she said, "I didn't know." And he nodded, "I didn't either, not until today." And Aruj reached out and held his hand gently, not like a lover but like someone who finally saw the weight he had been carrying. And Sahil said, "I always thought becoming someone meant proving the world wrong, but now I think maybe it's about proving to yourself that you survived." And she nodded quietly, because what else was there to say? And then he asked her a question that surprised them both. "Why did you really come back?" And she looked at him honestly, "Because I never stopped wondering what my life could have been if I just stayed." And he looked at her long and quiet, and then said, "Maybe that life wasn't meant for us, and maybe that's okay." And she nodded again, this time without crying, because something inside her had finally accepted it. And they sat in silence, two people tied by a history that hurt too much to keep and yet was too precious to forget. And when she stood to leave, she didn't say goodbye, just looked at him one last time and said, "If you ever want to talk about your father or what's next, I'm here." And he watched her go without trying to stop her, because this time there was no need, no bitterness, no unfinished sentence, just space. And then he looked back at the photo, the one with the boy and his father, and whispered, "I'll find you whoever you are." And that night, as the stars blinked quietly above, Sahil knew something was coming, something bigger than revenge or success or lost love, something that would pull him deeper into the mystery of his own blood. Sahil stood in the narrow alley behind the orphanage with the letter clutched tightly in his hand, the photo of the boy and his father folded inside his coat, and his breath coming out slow and steady like he was preparing to walk through a door that might never let him back out. The address he had been given was scrawled in the margins of an old envelope and led him here, to a quiet, forgotten place tucked away between tall buildings and broken walls, where children laughed and ran around unaware that one of them might hold the key to a truth buried in silence for more than 20 years. And he walked through the main gate, greeted by the kind-eyed woman who ran the place, and when he asked about the boy named Yusuf, her expression shifted just slightly, like she recognized something, not his face but the reason he had come. And she led him through the halls, past faded drawings and empty classrooms, until they reached a small courtyard where a boy around 16 sat alone, sketching in a worn notebook, and the moment Sahil saw his face he knew, not because he looked like the man in the photo but because he looked like Sahil himself, the same shape of eyes, the same sharp chin, and a quiet kind of sadness that mirrored the one Sahil had carried all his life. And Sahil's throat tightened as the woman called out, "Yusuf beta, someone's here to meet you." And the boy looked up confused and curious, and when Sahil knelt beside him he didn't speak at first. He just stared, taking in the details of this stranger who wasn't really a stranger. And then finally Sahil asked, "Do you know who your father was?" And the boy shook his head. "No one ever told me." And Sahil held out the letter, the one his own father had written years ago, and said, "Then maybe it's time you found out." And Yusuf read in silence, his eyes moving quickly, his lips pressed tight, and when he finished he looked up and asked, "Are you saying he was my father?" And Sahil nodded, and then Yusuf asked, "Who are you?" And Sahil said, "I'm his son too." And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the weight of blood and truth was heavier than either expected. And then Yusuf asked, "Why now?" And Sahil answered, "Because he died protecting your mother, and you deserve to know the man he really was." And the boy's eyes filled slowly, not with tears but with something deeper, the ache of belonging that had never had a name until now. And Sahil said, "I don't want to take you away or change your life, but if you ever need anything, I'm here." And Yusuf looked at him and said, "I don't have anyone." And Sahil said, "You do now." And they sat there together, not strangers, not yet family, but something in between, something real. And then the woman returned and told Sahil there was someone else waiting for him at the front, someone who said she knew his father too. And when Sahil walked back through the halls, his heart beat heavy because he couldn't imagine who else could still be connected to this thread of stories. And when he reached the door he stopped cold, because standing there was the last person he expected to see, his uncle, the man who raised him, who fed him, who stood at his mother's funeral with dry eyes and whispered promises of safety and truth. And now that same man stood here, older, thinner, his hands trembling and his voice broken, and he said, "I have something to tell you." And Sahil didn't speak, just watched him. And the man said, "I read your mother's journal after she passed. I know what your father told her. I know what I did, and I know I destroyed more than just his name. I destroyed a family." And Sahil's jaw clenched and he asked why. And the uncle said, "Jealousy, greed, shame, all of it and none of it. And I thought if I made him disappear I could take what was his and build something better, but I built it on lies." And Sahil asked, "Why now?" And the uncle said, "Because I'm dying. I have maybe weeks left, and I want to leave this world with one truth spoken out loud." And Sahil's voice cracked as he asked, "Do you know what he went through, hiding suffering while you lived off his ruin?" And the uncle nodded, "I do, and I see it now." And Sahil turned to walk away, because forgiveness wasn't something he could offer, not yet, maybe not ever. But the uncle called out, "One last thing, there's one more account in his name, one I never touched, hidden in a trust only you can open. It's yours." And Sahil paused only for a second, then kept walking, because money meant nothing to a man who had just found a brother he never knew. And that night Sahil sat beside Yusuf in the same courtyard, this time under the glow of the moon. And the boy asked, "What now?" And Sahil said, "Now you live and I live, and we don't run from what we were born into, we make something better." And Yusuf asked, "Can I come live with you?" And Sahil smiled and said, "Only if you promise not to eat all the ice cream." And Yusuf laughed, really laughed for the first time in years. And in that moment Sahil felt something shift, not a happy ending, not a perfect fix, but a quiet kind of peace, like the storm had finally passed and now it was just wind and open sky and days ahead that still needed to be written. And weeks later, when Aruj saw Sahil walking in the park with a boy beside him, a boy who looked just like him, she didn't stop him, she just smiled, nodded and walked on, knowing that even if their chapter had ended, the story had gone on, and somewhere deep inside her she was proud of him, not for the success, not for the empire, but for finding something truer, something real. And as Sahil and Yusuf walked on, Sahil said, "You know what your father used to say, sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you really are." And Yusuf nodded, "I think we're starting to find it now." And as they walked down the path the sun broke through the clouds, and for the first time in a long time it felt like home.